The first drops of rain came without warning, cold as ice, against the window of the old Dyer mansion. Each drop seemed heavier than the last, as if the clouds above were mourning something forgotten by the living. Eliza, who had just moved into the crumbling estate after inheriting it from a distant, unknown relative, looked up from the boxes she had been unpacking. She had heard stories about the place, stories whispered by locals who avoided the house like a curse, but she brushed them off as small-town folklore. As the rain intensified, the house came alive in unsettling ways. The wood creaked and groaned as if it were breathing, and the sound of water dripping echoed in places where no leaks should exist. The air grew colder with each passing second, and Eliza couldn't help but notice how the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally long when the lightning struck. The first true sign of something wrong came when she saw it, just beyond the rain-blurred window, standing at the edge of the forest that bordered the property. A figure, motionless, cloaked in the mist and downpour, staring directly at her. The figure was too far away for her to make out details, but the way it stood, utterly still despite the storm whipping around it, froze her in place. It wasn't until the figure raised a hand, slowly, unnervingly slow, that Eliza stumbled back from the window. When she looked again, it was gone, but the cold didn't leave. She tried to shake it off as a trick of the storm. "Old house, old nerves," she muttered to herself, though her voice trembled. She turned back to her unpacking, but couldn't focus. That's when she noticed the water pooling at her feet. A steady stream of ice-cold droplets fell from the ceiling above her, forming a perfect circle around her feet. Yet when she looked up, there was no leak. The ceiling was dry, perfectly dry. Eliza backed away, her pulse racing, but the water followed her. It spread unnaturally fast, rippling outward with every step she took, as though it was alive, chasing her. She slipped and fell, her palms hitting the cold surface, and for the briefest moment, she saw it again in the reflection of the water, a face. Pale, gaunt, and staring at her with hollow eyes that seemed to reach into her very soul. She screamed and scrambled to her feet. That's when the whispers started. It wasn't thunder or the roar of rain, but a chorus of voices, faint at first, growing louder with each passing second. The words were incomprehensible, but the malice in them was unmistakable. They seemed to come from everywhere, the walls, the floor, the very air around her. "Eliza," one voice broke through the cacophony, clear and sharp, like a shard of glass slicing through her ears. "Who's there?" she shouted, spinning around, but the room was empty. The sound of rain outside had vanished, replaced by an oppressive silence. Then, the door to the basement creaked open on its own. Eliza stared at the open basement door, her chest heaving. She had not touched, it had been locked earlier, stuck so tightly that she'd given up on forcing it open. Now, it yawned like a black maw, exhaling a draft of frigid air that made her skin prickle. The whispers grew louder, spiraling down into an incoherent chorus, echoing up from the darkness below. Her instincts screamed to run, to grab her keys, her coat, and flee this cursed house without looking back. But something rooted her in place. It wasn't just fear. It was them. The whispers tugged at her mind like icy fingers, drawing her closer to the basement, step by agonizing step. The rain outside returned, battering the house like fists against the windows. Yet as loud as the storm grew, the whispers were louder, almost as if the basement were a portal to another world. Each step she descended seemed to amplify the chill. She hugged herself, her breath clouding in the icy air. The first thing she noticed was the wetness. The steps weren't just damp. They were slick, as though rainwater had been cascading down them for hours. Her shoes squelched uncomfortably, and the deeper she went, the more she felt the water soaking through to her socks. The second thing she noticed was the smell. It wasn't mildew or rot, but something sharp and metallic. Coppery, the unmistakable scent of blood. At the bottom of the stairs, the faint light from the house above barely reached, leaving the basement swallowed in an oppressive gloom. Eliza fumbled along the wall for a light switch, her fingers brushing against cold, slimy stone. She cursed under her breath, fighting back the panic threatening to overtake her. Then, out of nowhere, a dim light flickered to life. A single bare bulb hung in the center of the room, swaying gently, as though disturbed by unseen hands. Its weak, flickering glow revealed the basement in horrifying detail. The walls were scrawled with symbols, crude and jagged, carved directly into the stone. Some looked like crude figures, people perhaps, while others were nothing she recognized, their jagged lines curling into patterns that hurt her eyes the longer she stared at them. The floor was covered in shallow water, though there was no obvious source. And there at the center of it all was the well. It was ancient, its stones blackened with age and slick with moisture. It shouldn't have been there. There was no mention of a well in the house's blueprints. But it stood as though it had always been a part of the house, waiting for someone to discover it. From its depths, a low gurgling sound echoed, like water rising and falling. But the sound carried a strange rhythm, almost like breathing. Eliza took a cautious step closer, her shoes splashing in the freezing water. She could see something at the edge of the well, perched delicately on the stone rim. A single object. A doll. It was old, its porcelain face cracked and discolored. Its eyes, one missing and the other cloudy, seemed to follow her as she moved closer. The doll's dress was soaked, its once pink fabric now a dull, bloody red, and its tiny hands were clutching something tightly. A photograph. Eliza picked up the doll with trembling hands and unfolded the damp, faded photo. Her heart dropped in her stomach when she saw the image. It was a picture of her, sitting at her childhood desk, no older than 7. She didn't remember this photo being taken, didn't even recognize the dress she was wearing. But there was no mistaking her own face, her own wide, frightened eyes staring back at her from the picture. A sound came from behind her, a wet, squelching noise, like bare feet slapping against the water. She whipped around, clutching the doll instinctively. The room was empty. "Leave," the whispers hissed in unison. It was the first time the voices formed a coherent command. Eliza staggered backward, her foot slipping on the wet floor. She fell hard, the doll tumbling out of her hands and splashing into the water. The whispers surged, louder and louder, until they became screams. She pressed her hands to her ears, but it did nothing to block the sound. From the corner of her eye, she saw movement. The water at her feet began to ripple violently, and slowly, impossibly, it started to rise, forming into shapes. Figures began to emerge from the shallow pool, their forms indistinct but undeniably human. Their faces were warped, mouths stretched too wide, eyes hollow and black as the abyss. The figures reached for her, their hands dripping with water that reeked of death. One of them grabbed her ankle, its touch freezing her to the bone. She screamed and kicked, scrambling to free herself. But the more she struggled, the tighter its grip became. More hands emerged, pulling at her clothes, her hair, dragging her toward the well. "Eliza," they whispered, their voices overlapping. "You belong to us?" The last thing she saw before she was pulled into the darkness was the doll, floating on the water's surface, its single eye staring lifelessly at her. Eliza felt herself dragged across the freezing water, her body paralyzed with terror and the sheer, bone-chilling cold of their grip. The spirits, if that's what they were, relentless, their watery fingers wrapping around her wrists, her ankles, pulling her closer and closer to the gaping black maw of the well. "No," she screamed, her voice raw with desperation. She kicked wildly, twisting her body against their unnatural strength, but it was like trying to fight the tide. The water surged around her, rising higher, creeping up to her chest. The whispers turned into guttural groans that vibrated through the room, shaking the very air. Then she heard it. From deep within the well came a sound, a low, rasping growl that sent an icy blade of dread straight through her chest. It wasn't human. It wasn't even close to human. The sound was ancient, primal, as though something unspeakable had just awakened from centuries of slumber. The water surged again, violently, nearly knocking her off balance. Her fingers clawed at the slick stones of the floor, desperate for purchase. She managed to grasp the edge of one of the carvings, her nails scraping against the sharp, jagged grooves. The symbols seemed to burn against her skin, as though the very act of touching them was forbidden. But she held on, pulling herself back with all the strength she could muster. "Let me go," she shouted, her voice breaking. Her free hand swung wildly, striking one of the shadowy figures. Her hand passed through it, but for a brief moment it recoiled, its watery form rippling as if in pain. Encouraged by this, Eliza grabbed a loose stone from the floor and swung it at another figure. The impact sent it shattering into a spray of water, its form dissolving into the pool below. The others hesitated, their movements growing sluggish, almost unsure. But the reprieve was brief. From the well came a deafening crack, like the sound of stones splitting under immense pressure. The figures froze, turning their heads in unison toward the well. Eliza followed their gaze, her heart pounding. A hand emerged from the darkness. It was massive, its fingers long and spindly, the skin a sickly gray-green, mottled with black veins. The hand gripped the edge of the well, its nails, if they could be called that, twisted and jagged like shards of bone. The air grew impossibly cold, and the light from the bulb above dimmed, flickering as if it, too, feared whatever was climbing out of the abyss. Eliza's body screamed at her to move, to run, but she was rooted in place by sheer terror. The hand was followed by an arm, then another, and finally a head. Its face, or what passed for a face, was grotesque, stretched and misshapen, with empty sockets where eyes should have been. Its mouth was impossibly wide, filled with jagged teeth that gleamed like broken glass. It pulled itself further out, its elongated body dripping with black, viscous water that reeked of rot. The whispers from the spirits stopped abruptly, replaced by an oppressive silence. Even the figures in the water seemed to recoil, retreating to the edges of the room as though afraid of the thing they had summoned. Eliza's survival instincts kicked in. She scrambled to her feet, her body trembling so violently she could barely stand. The creature turned its eyeless gaze toward her, its head cocking to one side with a sickening crack. Then it opened its mouth, and from its throat came a sound, a deep, guttural moan that seemed to vibrate through her very bones. She bolted. Her feet splashed through the water as she sprinted toward the stairs, the icy air slicing at her lungs. She didn't dare look back, but she could hear it behind her, the wet, slapping sound of its massive limbs dragging across the floor, its guttural growls growing louder. The stairs loomed ahead, but as she reached them, she slipped on the slick surface, crashing hard onto her knees. Pain shot through her legs, but she forced herself to crawl, clawing her way up the steps. Behind her, the creature let out a deafening roar, and the entire house seemed to shudder in response. "Eliza," it croaked, its voice deep and hollow, as though it spoke from the bottom of a vast, empty cavern. "You cannot run. You cannot hide." Her hands grasped the edge of the doorway at the top of the stairs. She hauled herself up, slamming the basement door shut behind her. She pressed her back against it, her chest heaving, tears streaming down her face. The whispers had returned, now rising in a frantic, overlapping cacophony. The doorknob rattled violently, and the door itself shook as though something was slamming against it from the other side. Then it stopped. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of her ragged breathing. She didn't dare move, her body frozen in place. After what felt like an eternity, she slowly stepped away from the door, her eyes never leaving it. A sudden crash from the living room made her scream. She spun around, her eyes darting wildly. The rain was still pounding against the windows, the wind howling through the cracks in the walls. But something was wrong. The air felt heavier, darker. She realized with dawning horror that the water had followed her. It seeped up through the floorboards, pooling around her feet once more. "Eliza," the voices whispered again, this time from all around her. "You cannot escape." The lights flickered and went out, plunging the house into darkness. And then, from the shadows, she saw them. Not one, not two, but dozens of figures, their watery forms dripping, their hollow eyes glowing faintly in the dark. They surrounded her, closing in, their whispers rising into a deafening roar. "Eliza, you belong to us?" The last thing she felt was the icy grip of their hands, dragging her down into the darkness. The icy grip of the spirits dragged Eliza to the floor, her body sinking into the freezing water that now covered the house like a rising tide. She struggled against them, but it was futile. Their hands were relentless, clawing at her arms and legs, pulling her deeper into the dark, frigid abyss that had overtaken the old mansion. As the water swallowed her, her senses began to fade. The cold seeped into her very bones, and the whispering voices became muffled, distant. The world above, the storm, the house, her life, felt as though it were being ripped away, leaving only darkness and the oppressive weight of the surrounding water. But just as she thought she would slip into unconsciousness, something changed. The voices grew louder again, but they were no longer whispers. They were screams, agonized, piercing cries that echoed in her ears. The surrounding water churned violently, and in the distance, she saw it, the creature from the well. Its grotesque form loomed larger now, impossibly massive, its eyeless face turned toward her as though it could see her every thought, her every fear. "Eliza," it growled, its voice reverberating through the water like a physical force. "You cannot escape your fate. You were chosen long before you were born." She wanted to scream, but her lungs were filled with icy water. The creature extended one long, spindly arm toward her, its clawed fingers reaching out as though to claim her soul. But then, something strange happened. The symbols, the carvings she had seen in the basement flashed in her mind. Those jagged, unholy markings etched into the stone walls. She remembered the way they had burned against her skin when she touched them, and for the first time, she wondered if they were more than decorations, more than meaningless relics of the past. Summoning every ounce of strength left in her, Eliza reached out with trembling hands. Her fingers brushed the cold, wet floor, searching desperately for anything she could use. Her hand closed around something solid, the loose stone she had used earlier to fend off the spirits. But this time, she wasn't going to fight them. She was going to fight it. She scraped the stone against the floor, carving one of the symbols into the wooden planks. The act sent a shockwave through her body, as if the house itself was trying to stop her. The air grew heavier, the water surged, and the creature let out an ear-splitting roar that shook the walls. But she didn't stop. She carved another symbol, then another, the lines jagged and imperfect but unmistakable. The creature recoiled, its massive form thrashing in the water. The surrounding spirits shrieked in unison, their forms flickering like dying flames. Eliza could feel the power of the symbols, an ancient, forgotten force that had been left behind in this house long before her time. Whatever these carvings were, they weren't meant to summon. They were meant to banish. "Eliza," the creature bellowed, its voice laced with fury and fear. "You cannot defy the pact. You cannot deny what you are. I don't belong to you," she screamed, her voice finally breaking free as she carved the final symbol. The lines glowed faintly, pulsing with an otherworldly light that cut through the darkness. The water surged again, but this time, it wasn't pulling her down. It was pulling the creature. The well reappeared, its jagged stones rising from the watery depths like a mouth opening wide. The creature clawed at the floor, its massive arms thrashing as it was dragged backward. The spirits were pulled along with it, their hollow eyes wide with terror as they dissolved into streams of water, swirling around the beast and vanishing into the black void of the well. "Eliza," the creature hissed one last time, its voice a dying whisper. "This is not over." With a deafening roar, the well slammed shut, the water draining away as if it had never been there. The house was left in silence, the air heavy with the scent of damp wood and decay. Eliza collapsed onto the floor, gasping for air, her body trembling uncontrollably. Hours passed, perhaps longer. She couldn't tell. When she finally found the strength to move, the first rays of dawn were breaking through the windows, casting pale light over the ruined interior of the house. The basement door was closed, and the carvings on the floor had vanished, leaving no trace of the battle that had just taken place. Eliza staggered to her feet, every muscle in her body aching. She glanced around, half expecting the spirits to return, but the house was still. The oppressive cold was gone, replaced by a faint warmth from the morning sun. She walked to the front door, her legs shaking, and stepped outside into the crisp morning air. The storm had passed. The sky was clear, the ground glistening with dew. For the first time since she arrived, the house felt empty. Whatever had haunted it, whatever had claimed it as its own, was gone. But as Eliza turned to look back at the house, her heart sank. On the window pane, faint but unmistakable, was the outline of a handprint. It was small, delicate like that of a child, and as she stared at it, she could swear she heard it again, the faintest whisper carried on the breeze. "Eliza!" She backed away, her breath catching in her throat. The house loomed behind her, its dark windows watching her as she fled down the driveway, the weight of its secrets still heavy in the air. The spirits were gone for now, but the rain would come again, and when it did, they would return,